I'm not going to introduce myself much. I'm a specialist in climate change communications. In particular, my passion has been how do we speak to people who are not here? How do we speak to the kinds of people who have different cultures, different values, particularly people who might have more conservative or traditional values in a way which engages with them and who they are, which I think is absolutely fundamental to moving forward with climate change. So I'll be touching on that. What I'm going to be touching on today is really my other great interest, which is the psychology of climate change, how our brains engage with it, and not just personal psychology, but social psychology, which is a different thing itself. I'm a social anthropologist by background. So how are the ways that collectively we make sense of this problem? The theme of this is snog, marry, and avoid, which is a sort of, a nice way of trying to break down responses. You've got snog, which is just get what you can out of it right now. Seek your pleasure. Just focus on the present. Very self-interested, selfish values. You've got marry, which is values of commitment, coming together. I mean, I'm talking about marry maybe in an idealized way, not bickering constantly and having sex 3 times a year. I mean, marrying. I'm so sorry. We should. We'll form a little support group, shall we? No, marry, okay, in a kind of like idealistic sense. But as we can see, but there's also problems with that. There can be an exclusivity to that. Or avoid, which is just to completely block things out, ignore them, and go into a kind of collective denial. I mean, because we haven't done very well on climate change so far, have we? I mean, we just haven't. I wrote a book on this called Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. And there's always a problem with book titles, because we don't ignore climate change. Some of us, and the people here in this room and in this gathering, really do get it. But the question is maybe more, why is climate change so challenging for us? Because when we're asking about how will we respond, if we imagine a situation, and I'm going to be looking at 2050, by the way, so like 25 years ahead. 25 years ago, if we'd been predicting how we might respond, many people would have said, well, it's going to be difficult to begin with, but we'll all come together. It's common sense. There's major costs involved. There's huge economic costs, so we can speak to that. The climate impacts are going to start coming down, and then people are going to wake up and they're going to go, wow, this is really serious. We need to do something. It might take a while, but when it really gets moving, it'll get moving. And in some ways it has, but in many ways it has not. We have not moved fast enough. Public attitudes, by the way, have barely shifted over 25 years. They go up and they go down, and there's a wobble, but there isn't some massive flow of concern or support for climate action. There isn't, and I mean, I do research on this. Huge sections of the population are still kind of uncertain about it. Large numbers of people, and in many countries the majority of people, still don't think that the science is settled. So there's something going on there, and we know obviously one of the things is misinformation, but there are fundamental ways that our brains find it hard to engage with climate change, no question. Now, as I said, I wrote a book on it which went into detail on this, and I interviewed many of the world's leading experts on this. But the one I think I'd like to pay attention to is attention. So let's pay attention to attention. We, this is why we say monkey brains. We inherit millennia of evolution. We have brains which are very highly attuned to what we pay attention to, and also, conversely, what we ignore, what we push to one side. That's how we keep sane. That's how we can hunt and gather. That's how we can go into a forest and we can spot that bird way up there on the tree and get it with our blowpipe. That's how we can decide who's our friend or who is our enemy. What do we pay attention to? What things are what psychologists will call salient, things which capture our attention. And we are carrying with us that inherited package of skills, which have proven very, very good. I mean, we are unbelievably good and smart and capable in many ways, but we have never faced a problem like this before, which requires a different kind of attention. So the big issue with us for climate change has been for a long time that we have a tendency to ignore things, or let's put it this way, we have a tendency to pay attention to things that are here, that are now, that have an immediate threat, that involve our own social group. And we have, in order to keep a line around things, we tend to ignore things which are far away, less certain, maybe don't involve our group or maybe involve different groups, which maybe involve a threat, but it's not a very clear threat. So climate change is always one of those things we've been aware of, but it hasn't captured our attention. And that's why, even now, if you go out and you ask people, are you concerned about climate change? They'll say, yeah, I'm concerned. If you ask people, what are you concerned about? We still have a problem, although it's changing over time, where large numbers of people don't mention climate change. But it doesn't trigger that immediate sense of attention. Now, there's a question which might already be in your mind on this, is when I'm saying, well, how do we respond to climate change? You might be going, well hang on, who's we? who is this we? And this is really also kind of a fundamental cause to the question we're asking, how do we respond? It's one of my regrets when I wrote my book, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. Like, you have to interrogate this word, our, we, right? That is also in its way an attention word. It's a category word, a very, very important one. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to talk about we in two ways. There's the we, which is the collective human way. That's in a way our inherited monkey brains. What I've described so far applies to every single human on the planet. How we pay attention to things, how we ignore things, what captures us. But there's another we, which is how will we respond, and that is very important. And I'm going to focus that primarily on the we in our group, our social group. So those of us in this room, those of us in our country, those of us in the rich world. There are going to be many people in the world whose response to climate change is going to be one of surviving, coping, adapting, dealing with it as best they can, because they're going to have no other options available to them. Which, incidentally, they may very well do better than we do, because they don't expect the government to deliver for them. They will very likely have much higher levels of social capital. They'll have much more sense of community and networks to draw on. So in that sense, we're quite disadvantaged. Why we need to focus on how we will respond is because we hold it in our power to change the situation. Because our community, recognizing that there's huge divisions within that and between rich and poor and so on, but collectively, our society and the rich world are responsible for the problem, and we are generating the pollution which is making it. And how we respond is also going to be kind of complex, because we are also going to be carrying with us the responsibility for the absolute mess we have created. And with great responsibility, unfortunately, comes great tendency towards denial, guilt, evasion, and projected blame, which is what we're going to look at. So that's the other category. So we categorize here, now. There, then. Us, them. These divisions. So where these divisions lie in the future will very much determine how we respond. I'm looking at 2050. So we're looking a generation ahead, maybe, if you have kids at 25. A generation ahead within the lifetime of many of us in this room, probably most, but far enough away that we're not talking about our immediate responses now. Now, the climate models, we were hearing yesterday from Tim Lenton, are very clear. They're dangerous, but they're clear. And in fact, the climate models have been pretty good, unfortunately erring on the side of underestimates for what the impacts will look like. So I'm not going to go into it, but let's say 2050 is going to be a mess. And, as we also heard from Tim, it's pretty well baked in. So we're going to have a situation where in 2050, we can kind of say what 2050 looks like. And it's going to be really, really messy, right? One of the questions is, when we're getting these big impacts tunneling down on us, and they will be, there'll be a cascade of major impacts. There might be some so major that actually our response is entirely just to cope with it. But there's going to be a whole string of things. One of the questions is that the point at which we snap out of this kind of docility and we say, right, this is the absolute dominant thing we have to work with? That has been the hope of activists and climate scientists for the last 40 years. I interviewed a whole lot of scientists around 2000, 2010. I said, what's going to snap us out? They said, when the impacts really start hitting. I would say, well, they are hitting now. No, but when they really start hitting. Well, and we can say now, here we are in 2025, they really are hitting now. And that snap hasn't happened yet. So that is one of the questions. Is there a point at which we snap out? And is there a point at which, when they're really coming down the line, we snap out in terms of saying, hell, we've got to face up to this problem, or that we just simply are so absorbed with dealing with a problem that we actually lose the capacity to even think ahead? Let's pass it over to you. Let's hear from... I'm not going to have a microphone going around, so shout out. Just thoughts here in the room. Yes, please.
I raised this with Tim Lenton yesterday, but when you were interviewing those scientists, was there a problem with the language they use? Because I think the combination of the media and the type of scientists they tend to get on and their very cautious language hasn't helped people to wake up.
Yeah. I would say that scientists, probably more than anyone, and especially back then, are coping with a very high level of psychological burden. Because they can see what's happening, they're feeling immense frustration that people are not paying attention. And so what you often hear from scientists is their own internal coping mechanism, which is partly to say it's not, that it's really serious, but well, the consistent science storyline that you hear in interviews is, yes, it's looking really serious, but there's good news. There's still time if we really pull together. They're still saying that about 1.5, which seems to be absolutely unbelievable. But it's a story which comes out of every cop, and personally it makes me scream. But yes, there is a problem with the language that they're using, but remember, they're exhibiting as a community or individually what I think our responses are as well, collectively. Let's have a couple more.
Hi. Yeah, I'm making a slightly different point. I'm speaking as a psychologist, so I actually think we run a very grave danger of over-psychologizing what's happening. That I think actually the thing that humans have that's different is the ability to look ahead, and will do so, but it's more to do with the messaging that comes from elites and leadership. It's much more a political issue. You know, if leaders were naming what was happening in a clearer way, and acting as if it was happening, I think people would turn towards it. They're able to turn towards wars or safer pensions. So I do think it's actually dangerous to over sort of play the role of psychology, this kind of psychology.
Yeah, I would just wanted to run on to from your point to say that it also really aids climate denial. This, we've still got time. It's still, in 10 years, or there's this. Because people start to say, oh, well, how come it's another 10 years? But I think it's part of the fact that we're predicting the future, which is highly unstable. But the point I was going to make before, in relation to your previous comments, there's two. One is about Laurie Laybourne's example of a boat that's about to hit an iceberg, and that's sort of the situation we're in. It's a bit simplistic, but it's helpful. And that we're now in a situation where we're going to go into it, right? So while we're trying to fix up the torn sail and the fact that a lifeboat has fallen off, we're also going to have to be steering the boat. And our leaders are really not prepared for the fact that now the mitigation we need to do is going to have to happen at the same time as dealing with massive, devastating, cascading impacts. And I think, that's going to put us in like a much, much trickier position than now. And the second point I was going to make is that actually in situations in which people's survival is threatened and their home is falling down and they don't have access to the same water, or their fishing boat's been destroyed, they're really not thinking, oh great, now I'll join the climate fight. They're thinking, oh crap, I need to survive. And then of course governments row back civil liberties, as we know from Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, and that will only happen more and more with the rise of the far right.
Thank you. This isn't going into a Q&A, so I don't necessarily want to turn it into one. But I do want to address your point. I think there is a danger always of over-psychologizing and underplaying the systemic causes. And most of my work has been in the field of communication, and particularly climate denial. I think I was the first person who ever used the term climate denial in print, so I kind of feel a certain attachment to it in an organised sense. But there is organised climate denial. I would say, however, my view is that the two things run in parallel. My view is that what the active programs of underplaying climate change and the denial we've seen do is very cleverly and strategically play on our innate tendency to disattend things. I think that the processes by which we express our concern follow well-established patterns. I think the tendency, for example, to generate a climate silence is strong, quite separate from the information of what happens. And I don't know if any of you have had this situation in your own lives, you can do your own little experiments on this, of trying to raise climate change with people and notice how a conversation just suddenly just fucking stops. It just goes bang. It dies with so many people. That, in my view, is a psychological process rather than a thing which has been planted, is that when people feel emotionally and morally insecure and they can't deal with something, they close down. There was a sociologist, Stanley Cohen, who worked for many years, specialised his entire life on this issue of collective denial, in which he said that societies enter into compacts, into contracts across entire societies about what can and cannot be talked about. And at its most extreme, this is happening in societies with major human rights abuses. Climate change is already a major human rights abuse and will become even more so. We're going to be challenged in the future of a sense of our own moral culpability for the situation which is created. However we define the we, and we can say, no, it's the oil companies, or it's this, or it's that, but it's also our flights, it's also the way that we live, it's a whole lot of other things. So what he said was that actually societies just close down the topic completely. They have agreed areas around which they will not talk. A very interesting follow-up to this was done by a sociologist, Kari Norgard, who's Norwegian, and she wrote a most brilliant analysis of how in Norway the entire subject of climate change gets closed down because there is a conflict between Norwegians' sense of themselves as being very liberal, reasonable, connected with nature, decent people, which is true, and the fact that they're one of the world's largest oil producers, and the entire economy floats on oil. And the end result of that was severalfold. One is that people did not talk about climate change. They closed down the conversation. The secondary aspect of it was that they started doing a lot of very, very eco things. They give money to climate change. They give a lot of overseas aid. In my view, it is not a coincidence, as we were hearing yesterday from Tim Lenton, that Norway is the country with the world's largest number of electric cars. I think there's a strong tendency for people who are feeling guilt in one regard to do divertory activities. The first thing I want to say is that the issue of our response has been very handily bandled. I need the coffee. Badly. Has been very badly handled in all modelling. So why this question is important, in my view, is because the existing models do not adequately account for how we will respond at all, and never have done. The socioeconomic models are based on assumptions of functioning markets and what economists would be accused of homo economicus, this idea of intelligent, rational people who make cost-benefit judgments in this. And that totally fails to anticipate both your point, which is the kind of like the systemic corruption within the system, but also I'd say fails to account for the fact that humans don't deal with things in necessarily a very rational way, because we actually tend to have a whole set of biases which say we're going to pay attention to that, not to that, or we're going to do this and not to that. I think the other reason this is important, so as I said, if we were to go back 25 years and we were to say how we respond now, the models were wrong. The scientific models were right, but the models and the assumptions about how we would behave were, in my view, wrong and continue to be wrong. So we need to incorporate a reality of how people respond. But the second thing is that if we know how things are going to, or if we can predict how things are going to be, we in our work as activists, as a movement, can anticipate that. So I'd say as a communication specialist, one of the things we did not adequately anticipate was the continuation and the extension of the polarization in society. And we have absolutely played into the hands of our enemies by continuing to double down on our strategy of talking to ourselves in our own language and our own values, ignoring the fact that there's a huge bulk of people out there who see the world differently. And in my work, I spend a lot of time, goodness knows, hundreds and hundreds of hours sitting in focus groups, listening and talking, listening primarily, to people who do not share my values, who are not green, who might have a very different view of the world. And I come out of that with thinking, first of all, we've really done a bad job speaking to those people. Secondly, wow, we've really opened up the space for our opponents to speak to them and saying, we share your values. And by the way, we're seeing all of this acting out in politics at the moment. But thirdly, actually really liking them. Because if you spend your whole time in your bubble, I might say, but we're filled with a kind of contempt often for people who are not like ourselves. And of course, they're people. They're people, and some of them are idiots, and some of them are adorable, and they're just the same people as everybody. And so if we could anticipate the way that we will respond, we could do better. we could do better in the future rather than constantly fighting over where we are. Snog, marry, and avoid. Okay, we're going to change them into slight order. I'm going to start, if I can, with marry. Okay? Again, in this idealistic, non-existent kind of platonic marriage idea. Marry in the sense of saying, we're going to work together. We're going to work together. We're going to make a firm commitment. We're going to make that change. If problems come up, we're going to face them as we go along. Again, like I said, really idealised marriage. We're not going to go in a half and not talk to each other for days. Marriage is a sense of people coming together to face the problem, which is good, which, as we know, is the thing that we would like. But as I said before, there's a warning in there that marriage, or this category, has a certain kind of exclusivity. The question, as I said, and always it's this psychological question of where do you draw the boundaries, and you say us and them. The question is, who are the people that we're cooperating with, and how strongly do we define that boundary around it? So, in an idealized situation where we need to work together, that would be working across humanity, recognizing that we have a shared purpose and is overcoming our various differences. Unfortunately, we've always got a competitive tendency within humans between cooperation and self-interested tribalism. The challenge is, how do we keep it on track for that and not have it imploding into self-interest? The challenge in 2050 is that when we're facing multiple impacts coming down the line, there will be a very strong impulse for us to just batten down the hatches and concentrate on the defense of our own group, combined with, undoubtedly, the emergence of a political force and a self-interested economic force that will make that happen, that will encourage us, say, we will look after you, we will defend you, we will protect you, we will look after your interests, and to do that, we're going to look after ourselves. Because we're the smart ones, we're the clever ones, we can survive this, we can work our way through this. This conversation's been bubbling away for the last 25 years on the edges of a discussion, and very strongly in the kind of libertarian right. So of course now it's coming right into the centre of politics. The Trump presidency, although it's tried to actually do the Stanley Cohen approach, just completely cutting out climate change and refusing to talk about it by removing it by this 1984 way of just kind of removing the words even from the vocabulary. Nonetheless, the senior people in the Environmental Protection Agency are coming out very publicly and saying, actually, our approach to this is adaptation. We can cope with this. We're smart, we're clever, we've got the technology. Go to the Netherlands and have a conversation with people in the Netherlands, both from the far right, from Geert Wilders and the far-right parties, and the whole way through I did a workshop with people from the main centre Democratic Party, the centre-left party. You hear the same narrative. In the Netherlands, you know what? We'll be all right. We've got the best water engineers in the world. We can cope with this. That's the marry option. The marry option is coming together. And remember, that isn't necessarily Mad Max. The thing that we are very good at as humans is working together. We're fantastically good at it. So facing a problem which is here and now, we could just go, right, well, we're just going to have to pull together. We're going to have to buckle down. We're going to have to get on with each other. One of the things which came out of COVID that was very interesting in the research was that although COVID was deeply traumatic for people, so many people said, actually, it brought me together with my neighbours. Yeah? Did you love it? Did you like the kind of sense of social cohesion?
The fact that people stayed in their local area and they didn't go off somewhere. They got to know their own area.
Yeah, but she's saying that people got to know their own area. They stayed together. We had a stronger sense of community. All of the research which comes through of how people respond to climate impacts suggests that actually, Rebecca Solnit wrote a very good book called Heaven Made in Hell. I, in my work and for my last book, interviewed people in several areas which had off-the-scale climate impacts, both in Britain and also in the States. I went, for example, along the New Jersey seashore. I think it was about 2 months after Hurricane Sandy, and I interviewed people there. And the overwhelming thing people wanted to talk about was how proud they were of their community, how they'd all come together, how it had been really hard, they'd gone through the trauma, they'd gone through it, and specifically things like how I'm a Democrat, my next door neighbour is a Republican, we used to never need to talk to each other, and now we're best of friends, we get along because we really helped each other out, how kind people are. All of these really positive pro-social values come to the fore. around adapting and coping with the problems that come down the line. I said to these people in New Jersey, I said, well, okay, that's very interesting, thank you. When was the last time you talked about climate change? They said, we're not talking about climate change. I said, well, you haven't talked about climate change after an event which all of the climate scientists are saying is definitely has the fingerprints of climate change all over it and therefore warning of what's coming in the future. I said, why the hell would we do that? Are you crazy? We're reconstructing, we're renewing. All of these re-words, by the way, renewing, rebuilding, restoring, these very positive things about putting things straight. So that is the default mode for a certain kind of marriage. Okay? I guess like a real marriage. If in a real marriage, you have a crisis, you have a problem, you put it together, you try and fix it. Super. Does that deal with the mitigation and the underlying problem? Only if through that sense of togetherness you face up to the problem, but not if you just completely lock down into it. Okay, marriage. Snog. Anybody had any nice snogging at this festival? Well, you're not all shouting out yes, so... Snog obviously is a joke, but snog is a shorthand for just simply self-seeking, self-interested, short-term pleasure and short-term goals. Let's put it that way. We know, I've already warned that the way that we respond to things tend to be very short-term. We have an overwhelming focus on the here, on the now, which dominates, especially rewards in the here and now. For my book, I interviewed Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman is the absolute godfather of cognitive psychology, and wrote a very good book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, if any of you have read that. I mean, Kahneman's brilliant. He got a Nobel Prize for his work on short-term thinking in economics. He said the real problem of climate change, and why he said I think it's an impossible problem, is because it deals with uncertainties, it deals with certain costs now against uncertain benefits or averting greater costs at some point in the future. So it's very true. That is totally what we're geared toward. So the Snog option is just doing things now. Maybe part of a response to people under trauma is to party, take lots of drugs, have fun. That could be kind of fun. I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing. We could all do that. But it can also be to cut down what psychology might call a hedonic response, is to cut down your time horizon into the short term, into the here and into the now, to contract. And one of my predictions is future responses to climate change will contract time horizons severely. But there's a tension there, yeah. But we go down and we say here, we just say here and now. There's also, as it were, a Snog option, which is looking forward to the future. Where are the people going to be making the money? And again, with respect to your point, where are the responses going to be which best serve the interests of the people who in many ways control the communications and control the language? For the moment, those lie with fossil fuel expansion and renewables, which is booming because there are economic reasons for that. As we move further into the future, we have these major impacts. There are going to be major opportunities coming from climate change. And don't think that capitalism won't move into it. We as a movement have been really bad at our predictions about capitalism, by the way. We have. I mean, I read, what got me into environmentalism a long time ago. I mean, like probably a book I read maybe 45, 50 years ago. It was a book that was talking about the imminent collapse of capitalism from the shortage and resource shortages. There was a lot of that around. There was a population bomb. There was this whole thing about how agriculture would collapse. We got it wrong. We keep underestimating the capacity of free market capitalism to take advantage of new markets and move into that space. I don't think capitalism will collapse by 2050. I think it will prosper, but it will prosper in some weird, aberrant, metastasized form, generating on climate impacts. New markets, new opportunities, huge transmissions of value from one place to another, which is where things make money. You only have to see in Los Angeles or Hawaii when there were major fires, the way that the property vultures would just circle round and round and round for the opportunities to consolidate property. Or one area will stop producing crops, another area might have opportunities. There's money to be made there. Huge monies in venture capitalism, and huge monies, by the way, in adaptation. I'm flagging this up again. For danger, that the adaptive response takes over. And so, if you think of it this way, governments make decisions on a cost-benefit analysis, right? The cost-benefit analysis for climate change is kind of weak. It's like, we have to do this cost now to achieve net zero for a benefit in the future which only really eventuates if every country in the world does it and we haven't got some weird tipping point that we've triggered. The cost-benefit, however, of the Thames barrage is really good. We spend this money on this and it saves central London from flooding, and you can put prices on both of those. So imagine that scaled up. Imagine a situation where adaptation gives clear cost-benefit analysis. Big engineering companies move into that space with adaptive. We're talking about the we in the sense of our economy, by the way. With big-scale adaptive responses, politicians get to walk around in hard hats, which they love. Think of the absolute catastrophe of HS2 and how badly that went because of these things lining up. Big projects, big money, internal corruption, politicians' egos for something that in the end doesn't work. So imagine that now applied to climate adaptation. So that's snogging. That's capital. That's large-scale macro engineering snogging. You're warned. And by the way, we're looking 25 years ahead, so don't think that because it isn't happening now, it won't kick into gear. There's a lot of stuff bubbling on the world of the financial media at the moment, which is talking about the massive opportunities in adaptation. That's all there now. By the way, I might also say from that, if a focus then goes on to an adaptive response, then it's very, very hard to take things out of the carbon of the fossil fuels. Because the argument will be, and this is the argument being put forward by President Lula at the moment in Brazil, who's just auctioning off huge areas of the Amazon, of a lot of developing countries, is climate change is real, and the only way that we're going to be able to prepare for this, both the transformation and the adaptation, is by maximizing our current assets at the moment. Right. Avoid snag Mori. Avoiding. Let me see if I can find my notes on here. So avoiding, well, there's outright distraction, right? There's the outright tendency to say, no, can't deal with that. I'm not dealing with that. I mean, we do it all the time. We have to. There's so many things around. Like, if you pay total attention to everything going around, you go absolutely barking nuts. We have to create these boundaries around ourselves. Imagine that accentuated in a future where there are large areas of the world facing major, major crisis, which is caused by the behaviour of our society. And in truth, me. I imagine most of you, the way we've lived, our own behaviours. Because part of what we're going to have to do psychologically is to balance this internally. Everybody thinks they're a good person. I'm writing a book on this subject at the moment about future responses, and one of the things which fascinated me is the psychology of criminals. Criminals have a morality. In fact, many criminals, and through my activism I spent quite a lot of time in cells chatting with people, many criminals actually have a stronger sense of morality about what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong, and they write themselves into that story in a way which justifies their own behaviours. It's not me, I had to do it. Oh, everybody's corrupt. You know, the whole society's corrupt. Well, they were kind of asking for it, weren't they, leaving their doors open? You know, well, what's the point? Well, it's what my mates do. Well, the police are corrupt as well. There's a whole set of narratives that they develop and stories that they develop. So part of avoiding is a kind of a distractive activity of saying, it's not me, it's them, I don't have to deal with this. And by the way, this is exactly what happens if you do detailed focus groups and you talk to people about climate change. They're acting, all of these things I'm talking about already in play. There isn't anything new in all of this. The question is, which ones in the competition will fight out and will win? That's also related to a kind of over-thereism. It's like, it's not me, it's them. I didn't cause it, it's them. Remember, in 2050, there's going to be a lot of blame floating around. And that blame has to attach itself. Let me take a little step out for a moment and talk about narrative and story. You know, we're story-generating creatures. We're driven by story. And climate change really struggles as a story. Strong narrative is based around a structure which is consistent across humanity. I've had the huge privilege in my work when I was working on rainforest to spend time in very remote corners of the world, sitting with people around their fire, people that were like sometimes very remote indigenous peoples, listening to them tell their stories with a translator helping me, and their stories are in every way the same kinds of stories as you would get in the Iliad or the Aeneid or in the Bible or Netflix or, or Star Wars or Marvel comics. The same structure. Heroes, enemies, struggle, a struggle, often a really strong struggle, and a resolution. Often a resolution which is a reinforcement of your values and your society and your moral values, or maybe it has lessons built into it. But this idea of good and bad, we have a real problem with climate change, which is that the enemies are very, very distributed. There isn't a clear enemy. And there isn't a clear enemy who really intends harm. And again, we can argue the toss on whether oil companies intend climate change, but I would say, I've spoken to a lot of people in oil companies, no, they don't. What they're doing is some massive, massive criminal psychology, moral displacement exercise. But even Donald Trump isn't thinking, this will really burn up the world. He's just an idiot and he doesn't care and he's not thinking and he's distracted. So when we come forward to 2050, the question is, well, who will be the enemy? Because the narrative which has a very clear enemy is going to be the one that wins. And that's the one which is going to dominate attention. We're not going to make ourselves the enemy because everybody's going to be doing this kind of moral displacement where it's not my fault, it's their fault. And so it's an open question. But I think that our response in the future will come down the lines of where we decide to allocate that blame. And we say, this is who's caused it. And it might fall to oil companies, it might fall to capitalism. It might be, by the way, in all of this, that there might be ways to generate very positive changes in society, as we know. But the narrative will steer the direction. It might be that we're blamed, by the way. Don't think that isn't happening. Don't think that there's an awful lot. I haven't got the figures, like thousands of environmental activists get killed every year. We as activists could very well get the blame. Yeah? Or there's a distractive form, which is an over-thereism, which is about another problem altogether, a distractive problem. So I think part of a danger of conflict, we know that there's already a danger of conflict in terms of this kind of the marriage options, as it were. It's like we're going to defend ourselves and our rights, of fighting over resources. But there's also a distractive danger of wars which are created or existed or fueled for the purpose of distractive strategies. There's a lot of options for that. In other words, that the people who could and should be making the decisions can go, no, not now, I can't deal with it right now. We've got so many other important things to deal with. We've got this and we've got this and we've got this. So this idea of a polycrisis is real, but I think there's a psychological polycrisis as well, which is it allows you to make a decision about what you pay attention to. And you tend to the thing which is here and now, has a threat, has the enemy with the intention to cause you harm. The narrative which is the strong narrative, that's the one which drives you. So that's a kind of distraction. There's outright denial. And don't think, by the way, if climate change is crashing around our heads, that people are necessarily going to snap out of denial. If anything, it will fuel it. And any of you have had an experience, either yourself personally or with someone you know and love, of addiction, will know how powerful that sense of denial can be. How capable people are who are, when they're absolutely falling apart, can go, I haven't got a problem. In fact, how capable people are under addictive circumstances of doubling down, of going, oh, I haven't got a problem, look, I'll have another drink, look, I'm just a party animal. This kind of doubling down practice is already well underway. When people's values and their identity are challenged. Thank you. We'll go to questions right now. When people's identity and values are questioned, one of their natural default mechanisms is not to change their value and their identities, but to double down and say, I'm right, you're to blame, don't tell me what to do. It's exactly the process we're seeing acting out in politics, particularly in the US. And then the final point on that, of the avoiding, is what happens at this really unusual, unique moment in human history when trillions of dollars are being invested into the technologies of mass distraction, moving into a future when we will have more than ever things we don't want to pay attention to. And as it were, it's an open question, but I think it's a really, really serious one. What happens? You can already see how like kids now are being groomed to spend their lives on screens. What happens when we move into a world where there is a possibility in the technology to just disappear completely into your virtual reality headset, to utterly ignore what's going on around you? You've got a reality you don't want to face, you've got a fantasy world which actually, through the wonders of AI, is exactly tailored to what you want it to be. What happens? I think it's extremely dangerous. So basically, thoughts about how to get out of this, and then we'll have a few minutes on your thoughts as well. 1, inoculate. Part of a way of dealing with misinformation in society and climate denial and the kind of lies we get fed by the fossil fuel industry is to inoculate, is to say to people, look, they're going to tell you that this is going to happen and they're going to lie to you and you need to be ready because these are their motives. Getting in before them to say this is what's going to happen so that when the messages come, people go, hang about, is that real or are you just lying to me because I heard that you were going to do that? It effective and it works with climate denial. I believe that it can work in this case. If we say, people are going to tell you, don't worry, it's fine, we're smart, we can manage this. We've got 25 years to plant the warning that those are the messages people are going to hear and to inoculate messaging and communications, which we fail to do on climate change, generally. Secondly, obviously, we can try and build a sense of a we which embraces more than us, which is open, which is collective. But I would go, and is all of humanity, but this is a human challenge, a human test for us with with our monkey brains, with everything we've carried through from our inheritance. How do we respond to this? I'd say that collective identity goes deeper into our own society. It's going back to that point I said about involving people who are not literally in this tent, of making everybody in our society feel that they have something to offer, that they are of value, that they have something to contribute, whoever they are. That diversity includes people that we do not agree with, who we might disagree with on many things, but everybody is a part of this and a part of a solution. That is fundamental. So the definition of the marriage, as it were, is about building the bridges between ourselves within our own society, and especially being very careful, I think, with the sort of hate speech within our own movement, of which there's a lot, because people get very upset and annoyed and angry. We don't have to mirror what the other side does. I think the message overall in my own work on communications has been, how do we find a way of building language which creates a sense of common identity across societies, that we're all in it together, along the lines of what in some ways we had with COVID. That's why it's so powerful. And the third thing I say is I think we have to take climate change out of this area of cost-benefit analysis, where it is permanently lodged. Because the cost-benefit analysis will not support mitigation in the long run. What we have to say is that there's values that go beyond this. There are sacred values. We all have sacred values. Sacred values are the things which go beyond cost-benefit. For people of religious faith, somebody who's deeply faithful, you can't tell them to have a bacon sandwich and say, I'll give you $1 million. Okay, no, I'm not doing it. You can't say sell your children to. You can't say Elon Musk. Elon Musk hasn't got enough kids, so he'll give you $1 billion for yours. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands of who here would sell their children. But you might be doing a lot of cost-benefit analysis in the moment, going, well, yeah, it might be all right for them. It couldn't be that bad. And after all, I could do a lot for $1 billion. The truth is that people, thanks, I said it. The truth is that people are not going to do that. So those are the sacred values. So how is climate change and the sense of sacredness and the sacred values part of this? And the final point of that is going back to the collective we. How do we draw on those values which are already there? We're not going to shift people's values. In 25 years, we're not going to do it. So how do we reach out to people maybe of more conservative, more traditional values and say, actually, climate change, that's what you really care about. Your sacred values are about protecting our country, protecting our countryside, defending our institutions, defending wildlife and nature, which is very strong for people. That's why we need to work together. So let's not get divided. Okay, we've got 5 minutes. Let's go out to other points. Anybody who'd like to say anything? There's somebody just there. There we go, thanks.
Hi. To your second point about collective, I think sometimes we worry that if we get people who are, say, from the far right in a room, they will just talk their own stuff. Actually, that's not true. So I've worked for an organisation called ScienceWise, which is in central government for many years, and we do participative work on really, really difficult science, often science that nobody has ever heard of yet. And it's deliberately demographically mixed. and actually over-represents the people who may be losing out on whatever thing that we're talking about. And when people get in a room with, it has to be with scientists and with people, with ethicists, people who really know, they absolutely leave hold of the things that they've heard. And I talk to them because I mentor this stuff. I talk to them at lunchtime and I say, but hang on, you said that you read, this paper. How does what you just heard fit with that? And they go, papers, just, that's just fish and chips paper tomorrow, isn't it? And they really, really connect with the scientists, because when the scientists are good and they're not speaking different languages, when they're really being themselves and genuine and people, which they can be absolutely wonderful, absolutely you connect, because we're humans and we connect. And they always come up, all of those publics, every single time, come up with really, really good policy. So if you hear about citizens' assemblies, they are fantastic, if done well, if the question is right and all that kind of stuff. So making citizens' assemblies very, very good quality will actually, I see it, ameliorate all of the problems at once.
Thank you so much. It's such a good point. And it stands alone, but just to build on that part of the solutions we need to be working for are ways that people can meet outside their group. Because the power, and I've seen it myself of citizens' assemblies, is that people from completely different places. There's a very, very powerful thing which happened on the Irish Assembly about gay marriage, where a guy who was a kind of absolutely staunch, dyed-in-the-wood homophobe ended up getting really close to this gay guy. Because when you meet humans, you connect as humans. So how do we build in the processes and the institutions for people to come together? Which could, by the way, also be through adaptation, so we can work with that. Yes.
I feel that XR has already done just about everything that you've described here as a solution. And it has led to improvements in awareness, but not in solutions in terms of persuading people that climate change is something that they need to pay attention to. And that, I think, is because what people feel is sacred is their lifestyle. And every time we talk about climate change, then the fear is no more oil and therefore much lower lifestyle. So how do you overcome that?
I've been learning a bit about, in recent times, about in the context of how trauma affects us individually, psychologically. We fight, we flight, we freeze, and we can dissociate and tune out under traumatic circumstances. I'm wondering if that has a role in our wider social context, that when you dissociate, you don't notice that you're dissociating. So you're tuning out, but you don't know you're tuning out. Is that part of something we need to watch out for?
So I have to say to the gentleman here, I'm not familiar with X-Power and the work of it, but I agree that there has been a failure in order to engage. I think it's been really hard to reach out. The trauma response, absolutely, and we're going into a situation of future trauma. But there's also, by the way, just to say quickly on trauma responses, there's also there's PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's also post-traumatic growth, PTG, and there's a lot of research on that. But people going through traumatic experiences sometimes have a much stronger sense of meaning and purpose, which emerges from it. So trauma is not necessarily a destructive thing. The process of recovering from trauma can be a personal growth.
So
I'm going to be
really
outside, so if anybody likes to...
So can we have a big hand for Clive?